you absolutely have to hike the Grand Canyon because you have a front row seat to some amazing, amazing trekking across the Grand Canyon, literally walking through geologic history for billions of years. Yeah, you've seen it, but you really haven't experienced it yet. And here's why. So my name's Sunny Stroeer. I was born and raised in Germany. I now live in Kanab, Utah, in the very southern part of the state, just about an hour, hour and a half from the north rim of the Grand Canyon. And I split my time between the desert and the mountains because I am the founder and owner of Awe Expeditions, which is a women's mountaineering company. And I also, together with my husband, co-own Dreamland Safari Tours, which is a hiking and backpacking guide company here in southern Utah. We're one of the area's premier outfitters. Even though I split my time between the desert and the mountains, I time and again find myself coming home to the Grand Canyon, coming home to the desert. That's a place that I really fell in love with quite young. You know, when you look at the imagery and you kind of have an idea, maybe you've visited the Grand Canyon, you've spent some time here, maybe it doesn't need any explanation of why I am so in love with this place, but I do want to take you through just a little bit of my history, just so you know. I first came to see the Grand Canyon when I was 13 years old. This is me right here, sometime in the 90s, on a family trip, vacation, you know, big bucket list summer type of adventure. And I absolutely fell in love with the Grand Canyon specifically, and with the Southwest right then and there. And ever since then, I have made it a point to keep coming back to the Grand Canyon to explore, to hike, to backpack, to do all the things. And over the years, that repertoire of experience has built into almost 700 miles below the rim, more than 50 days and about 30 plus nights that I have spent below the rim of the Grand Canyon, including in 2018, 150 miles going east-west in the Grand Canyon as part of the Haydoop Trail, which is a big through hiking route in Utah and northern Arizona. It's about 800 miles plus minus, depending on how you do it. This is me here at the bottom of the Grand Canyon while I was on this Haydoop Trail for about 32 days all in all. But I don't just love going deep and going long and, you know, really getting to get in there and exploring. I also love doing things quickly. I am a so-called FKT holder, so I have a few fastest known times or speed records to my name, including a speed record on what's called the rim to rim to rim alt. Now we can get into that in a little bit more detail later on. It's not the same as a rim to rim, you know, very different story. But point being, you know, I've done a lot of miles in the Grand Canyon. I've spent a lot of days, a lot of nights in there. And I'm really, really excited to be able to share with you today why I think the Grand Canyon is so amazing and how to think about and approach planning for, preparing for a rim to rim backpacking trip. We're going to cover a bunch of different topics. We're starting out with why you really want to go below the rim versus staying on the rim. But once we move beyond that, I'm going to take you through the highlights of what you're going to find on a rim to rim. I'm going to talk to you about the greatest challenges of preparing for a rim to rim and how to know if you're ready for them and how to make sure that you're putting in the training that you need to be ready for them. And then I'm also going to touch on very hands-on tactical advice for the things that you need, both in terms of gear and in terms of planning, if you want to go ahead and put your own rim to rim together without a guide. Starting with the first topic, why below the rim? Why not, you know, stay up above the rim and enjoy those beautiful views that you can see from the very tippy top there? I have a couple of very clear answers to that. I mean, I love the views from the rims. I think they're absolutely spectacular. And I also recognize that when you're on the rim, on the north rim, which is more remote and less visited, you have about 1 million visitors a year. On the South Rim, which is where most people go, you have about 5 million visitors a year. And in between, below the rim, you have fewer than 15,000 overnight permits that get issued every year. So as far as numbers go, there is absolutely no comparison between the experience that you get from the top of the rim, where you're, you know, in the crowds and kind of rubbing elbows with hundreds, if not thousands of your closest friends on any given day, versus being below the rim and having this entire massive, huge playground, maybe not all to yourself, but, you know, more or less to yourself. You really can't experience the Grand Canyon in depth without going deep. To put a couple more numbers to it, this here, typical kind of Grand Canyon Rim viewpoint perspective, lots of people enjoying the views, lots of people enjoying the magnificent scenery. 6 million visitors all in all at the top of the rim, north and south combined. There is a total of 15 named trails in Grand Canyon National Park that are above the rim, and about 65 miles amongst those 15 named trails. Now, if you flip that on its head and you go below the rim, we are now looking at 29 named trails and routes and more than 400 miles of trails. And chances are, the feeling that you're going to get and the sort of experience that you're going to have in there is a lot more secluded. It's a lot more remote. It's a lot more solitary. It's a lot less like Disneyland and a lot more backcountry and wilderness. And that's what I personally really, really love. I also think that, when people say, oh, why would you go down into the Grand Canyon? You can't even see the beautiful views because you only got to see them from the rim. I would argue that that's entirely not true. You get to see views like this one, for example, if you push all the way deep to the bottom of the Grand Canyon. And you also get to see sunsets and happiness like this. This was me on one of the several rim to rims that I've done in my time here. So long story short, since you're here, I'm sure I don't have to convince you why you all should make a plan to venture below the rim in the Grand Canyon. Many of you have already done that. But yeah, to me, when people say, oh yeah, I've been to the Grand Canyon and they've gone to the South Rim or the North Rim for a day or two and seen some of the viewpoints. Yeah, you've seen it, but you really haven't experienced it yet. So I personally love to do whatever I can to help and support as many people as possible to have the tools and the knowledge that they need to get down into the canyon. Talking specifically about backpacking rim to rim, what are we looking at? We are looking at the connection between the main North Rim and the main South Rim, which is right in the middle of Grand Canyon National Park. It's the so-called corridor trails. And there is really only one option, more or less, to get across the big ditch and connect those two trailheads. If you've been there, it's not entirely true. There's actually a little variation, but for the most part, you're heading down the South Rim on Bright Angel Trail, and then you're crossing the river at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. You're going back up to the North Rim on the North Kaibab Trail. That is the only trail that will take you up to that main North Rim. In theory, when you're talking about a rim to rim of the Grand Canyon, it doesn't have to be from the main North Rim to the main South Rim or vice versa. There are other options to get across the canyon. And I've kind of indicated one here in the upper left-hand corner of this map out to the west. There are other trail systems, not many of them, but there are a couple of other trail systems that maybe potentially could allow you to connect the two rims, mostly on trail. The challenge is that the only place to safely get across the Colorado River at the bottom of the Grand Canyon is on the main corridor trails, because that is the only spot where there are two bridges. So this picture right here is from an adventure that I had a couple of years ago, where two friends of mine and I did the so-called rim to rim to rim alt, which is the route that I indicated here in that light red line in the west of the canyon. But, there are trails that take you from the rim to the river and then back up the other side, but there's no bridge at the bottom, so you have to swim the river. This is not something that I would recommend at all. Definitely do not even think about doing that on the corridor trails. There's very, very dangerous rapids right there. But, there are some adventurous alternatives and variations on connecting Grand Canyon rim to rim in case you're curious. As far as the route going from the rim down to Phantom Ranch and then back up to the rim on the same side, in theory, that's a rim to rim as well, right? But Grand Canyon nomenclature is such that we actually wouldn't count that as a rim to rim. We'd count that as a rim to river to rim, where a rim to rim always connects with the opposite rim. The map that you're looking at right now zooms in on the corridor trails, and it shows you in more detail what type of mileage and what type of vertical change you are looking at if you are thinking about tackling that marquee, really well-known rim-to-rim trip. We're looking at about 23 miles going across, and we're looking at over 10,000 feet of elevation change, depending on which direction you're going. If you're going from north to south or south to north, you may have a little bit more up or a little bit more down, because the north rim is at about 8,000 feet, and the south rim is below 7,000 feet. So if you go north to south, you have more downhill. If you go south to north, you have more uphill. I do want to share with you some impressions and a bit of an idea of what you are going to find on maybe not a mile to mile basis, but kind of, going through the various sections of hiking rim to rim. And I'm going to take you through that from the South Rim to the North Rim, because most visitors to the Grand Canyon start with visiting the South Rim. And so that's kind of the familiar perspective. Starting at the top of the South Rim. And if you follow Paul, this is my husband actually, he's literally pointing at the corridor and at those corridor trails that take you all the way across from south to the north. If you look closely, a little bit below his hand, down in the middle of the Grand Canyon, you can actually see a trail that takes you out on the middle level of the Grand Canyon that is called the Tonto Plateau. That's a trail that goes out to Plateau Point. That's not necessarily a trail that you'd be on if you're just doing a rim to rim in its purest manifestation, but it is a relatively quick and easy side trip of about 3 miles to get out to Plateau Point, and it's very, very beautiful. If you're starting your rim to rim backpack and you've kind of taken in a view from the south, you know what's coming and you've seen that amazing massive scenery and you're thinking, oh wow, I'm going to walk across that entire thing. You are now ready to start descending into the Grand Canyon. And there are two options. I kind of touched on that earlier. You can choose between descending the Bright Angel Trail or the South Kaibab Trail. They're both beautiful. They both have, different trade-offs and options. But no matter which trail you choose, you're pretty much starting from the same spot and you're going down, 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 down on pretty good, pretty well-developed trails. These trails are used by lots of hikers each day. They're used by mule trains that go down to Phantom Ranch at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. But you do have to be aware that it may not look like this depending on what time of year you're visiting, because it might just as well look like this. In the, kind of winter through early or sometimes even late spring months, you may find snow at the rims of the Grand Canyon. And, so that's something that you want to be ready for. If there is snow up high, this is what the trails may look like. It is very rare that the trails are not passable, particularly on the south side, but it does happen from time to time. So that's something we're going to talk about as well when we think about, how to plan for logistics of a hike like this. As you descend though, even if it was snowy up top, you are going to leave that behind. You are going to descend through time and across a lot of switchbacks and lots of steep steps down into the depth of the Grand Canyon. It's going to start getting warmer. It is going to start getting a little bit more lush in terms of vegetation. And then if you are descending on the Bright Angel Trail, the first major waypoint or, first major segment end that you're going to come to is Havasupai Gardens, which used to be called Indian Gardens, now Havasupai Gardens, which is a campground about 5 miles down from the rim. It's beautiful camping in there. And this is the moment where you have an opportunity, if you were lucky enough to get camping capacity, camping availability at Havasupai Gardens, you can go ahead and you can do that side trip that I was talking about earlier, going out to Plateau Point on the Tonto Plateau. And Plateau Point is really beautiful because one, you can see amazing sunsets there, as you can tell from this picture here, but two, you also have a really beautiful view of the river. And, when you're starting at the top of the rim, of course, you will know this if you've visited the Grand Canyon before, you're not seeing the Colorado River from most anywhere on the south and on the north rim. There's a couple of spots where you can spot it from the rim, but those are very hard to get to. For the most part, the Colorado River is just this mythical kind of concept that we know has carved the Grand Canyon, but as visitors on the rim, we don't actually get to see it. If you hike out to Plateau Point, this is the first time where you really get to take it in its full glory. If you were lucky enough to get a camp spot at Havasupai Gardens and you maybe walked out to Plateau Point for a beautiful sunset and dinner, you are then in for a beautiful night of amazing stargazing and just beautiful starry skies, because light pollution in the Grand Canyon, as you can imagine, is very, very low. That means that if you are up in the night or if you are sleeping and camping without a shelter, without a tent potentially, you have a front row seat to some amazing, amazing stargazing. Moving on from Havasupai Gardens, you would continue further down towards the river. This section that we're looking at here is called the Devil's Corkscrew. You can see the steep switchbacks kind of on the left-hand side of the picture. This is what drops you from the Tonto Plateau level down into the inner gorge of the Grand Canyon and down towards the Colorado River. Once you have come down the Devil's Corkscrew, you are again now in shouting distance of the river, essentially, and you are quickly quickly going to start approaching the two spots in the Grand Canyon where it is possible to safely cross the river on a bridge. In this photo that you're looking at here, you can see the Silver Bridge in the foreground, and then in the background, further upstream on the river, if you look closely, you can also see the Black Bridge. Those two trail bridges are the only two bridges across the Colorado River in the Grand Canyon. So if you are trying to go north to south, if you want to do a rim to rim in the conventional way, you have to come across one of those two bridges. You can see, looking at the water, below the bridges here, it is white water, there's rapids. It would be very, 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 very dangerous to try and avoid those bridges. And if you ever go on a big epic adventure far away from the spot that does require crossing the river, that is an entirely different beast. And it's not something that a lot of people do. Once you're at the river, you are now within shouting distance of Phantom Ranch and Bright Angel Campground. Phantom Ranch is an amazing historic ranch right at the very bottom of the Grand Canyon. There actually used to be a swimming pool down there many, many decades ago. So it is pretty impressive, to see the history and the architecture of those buildings. Now, Phantom Ranch is a place where, if you're very lucky, you could spend a night sleeping in the cabins at Phantom Ranch, but those are very, very, very hard to reserve. It's a lottery, and it takes a lot of luck and a lot of persistence to be able to get reservations, and years of planning to make that happen. So be aware of that. Because Phantom Ranch is so highly in demand and so difficult to get reservations at, what most hikers and backpackers will do is they will secure reservations or permits for Bright Angel Campground, which is the campground that's right across from Phantom Ranch. And it's still a really beautiful spot to be. And you also still get to kind of experience Phantom Ranch, because if you've pre-planned, you may be able to have reserved a meal there. And at the very least, if you're there during open hours for the cantina, you might be able to go and buy some lemonade and maybe even send a postcard from the bottom of the Grand Canyon, because there is the possibility to buy and then mail postcards. They get carried out from Phantom Ranch by mule. So it takes a couple extra days for sure for them to reach their target, but it's a very, very unique thing to do. And your postcards will get stamped with a little stamp saying this was sent from the bottom of the Grand Canyon. So it's a really cool keepsake for whoever you're sending that postcard to. Once you move past Phantom Ranch, and again, we're going from the south to the north at the moment, you're then entering what is called the box. It's kind of this, flat-ish area at the bottom of the Grand Canyon where you're now putting down miles. And it is very enjoyable, very beautiful hiking deep down in the canyon. It also can get incredibly hot in the summer. So that's something to be aware of. We're going to talk about conditions and temperatures more later on. Once you're down at Phantom Ranch, the elevation change kind of lets up for a little while, and you're looking at just traversing from south to north at this point. If you're lucky, you may be able to make a side trip to Ribbon Falls, which is not far off the corridor trails, and it's a beautiful, beautiful waterfall. It used to be that there was a bridge that would get you to Ribbon Falls because you have to cross a creek in order to get there. That bridge, unfortunately, has been damaged and was removed not too long ago. So at the moment, there's no bridge. And depending on the conditions in the Grand Canyon, depending on water levels, you may or may not be able to actually access Ribbon Falls. But if you have a chance, this is a side trip that's absolutely worthwhile. And once you're past Ribbon Falls, you then start climbing towards the North Rim. Now, remember what I told you, that the North Rim is at about 8,000 feet, and you have a bigger vertical difference between the North Rim and the bottom than you have between the South Rim and the bottom. So if you are coming up the North Rim, just be ready for a long and arduous climb. You really, take it slow and steady, keep putting one foot in front of another, but you are going to be pushing and climbing about 6,000 feet in, one single go pretty much, because there's no camping opportunities between the bottom of the North Rim and the top of the North Rim. You have to be ready for that, and you have to know and trust yourself that your body is capable of handling that, on top of all of the work that you've already done and on top of the potentially challenging conditions that you may face. As you get higher up, this is hopefully what you're going to be feeling. This is what I typically feel like when I'm about to go and crest the rim. And then eventually you will have done it. You're up there, you're on the North Rim, you're now in a slightly more remote and, less accessible spot than you were when you started at the South Rim. rim. And hopefully you're going to have the opportunity to go and once again take in those spectacular views and really bask in and celebrate the achievement that you've just accomplished and revel in all of the memories that you made by trekking across the Grand Canyon, literally walking through geologic history for billions of years. So that's the Grand Canyon rim to rim in pictures. It is, a bit of an impression of what you're going to see and what you may experience if you tackle a hike or backpack like this. I now want to dive in and specifically talk about some of the things I already alluded to, which is challenges. What makes this hike or this backpack difficult, and what can you do to address those challenges? I probably don't have to reiterate the fact that the Grand Canyon has a lot of vertical change. I was saying it's about 11,000 feet of vertical change if you're going rim to rim. And depending on which direction you go, that's 5,000 feet down and 6,000 feet up, or 6,000 feet down and 5,000 feet up. But that is, something that you absolutely have to consider. You're going to be looking at lots of switchbacks, lots of steepness, lots and lots and lots and lots of vertical gain and vertical loss. What takes people by surprise sometimes, actually quite frequently, I would say, based on what I've seen, is that, the downhill, seems like, okay, it's not that bad. We can go and do that because it's not that difficult from a cardio perspective. The uphill is the thing that, everybody has a lot of respect for, and that gets people a little bit anxious and nervous, and that really gets some training to prepare for an endeavor like this. As it turns out, the downhill is just as hard, if not harder, than the uphill. And here's why. So on the uphill, you are looking at, really pushing hard. You're looking at cardio exertion. You're looking at managing temperatures and all of that. Like, it's a hard climb. I'm not going to deny that. But the downhill, even though your lungs aren't working as hard, your legs are working really, 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 really hard. I mean, when in regular life do you ever descend 5,000 or 6,000 feet over the course of a couple of hours, right? And you're starting out your trip with that. So being ready for that elevation gain and loss and knowing how your body is going to react to that, that's something that's really, really important. We're going to touch on a couple of ideas for how to get ready for that in the training section a couple minutes down the line. The other thing that you're going to want to think about as you think about challenges is exposure. So, this picture right here is not part of the rim to rim, but I did want to share this with you just so you have a good firsthand impression of just how steep and rugged that terrain is. This is a nice little picnic here, a little closer to the rim than my mom for sure would like, but you get the idea. We're sitting there on the North Rim and you can look down hundreds of feet. Actually, they're probably a little over 1,000 feet down to one of the lower layers here in the North Rim of the Grand Canyon. You have a lot of elevation change, and you do have a lot of really steep and quite exposed terrain. So that's something to be aware of. For folks that aren't incredibly afraid of heights, that just kind of have a natural, human respect for heights, I have found that exposure on the corridor trails is actually not that bad. This right here is an example from the North Kaibab Trail. That's probably one of the most exposed sections with the biggest drop-offs and biggest unprotected drop-offs, for the entire rim to rim backpack. Depending on, what your comfort level with heights is, this may either look completely casual or it may look a little bit anxiety inducing. But this is a short section. It's, a wide, completely flat trail. You have a big solid wall on your right-hand side if you're heading down the hill. So if you can handle a section like that, you should be able to handle pretty much anything that the rim trails throw at you, because it doesn't really get any worse than that. So I do want you to be aware of the exposure and of the steepness and of the fact that there are sheer drop-offs. But if you can imagine being comfortable with a section like this, you should be pretty okay with the entirety of that trail system. The thing that I personally believe is the biggest challenge, and that most people who hike in the Grand Canyon from the rim to the bottom for the first time underestimate, is how radically conditions change between the rims and the inner canyon. This picture right here is a photo from the South Rim from about, I think, 3 or 4 weeks ago. You can see massive amounts of snow. Everybody's bundled up. We're seeing bare hands. So the temperatures were probably pretty nice. They were probably somewhere in the 40s 40s or so, but it is full on winter conditions. And it could be even colder if it wasn't a sunny day and if it wasn't, kind of pristine late winter, early spring weather. But then by the time you get down to the inner layers of the Grand Canyon, the inner gorge, you may be looking at temperatures, even while there's snow up top on the rims, that are easily in the 80s or 90s. And during the summer, you may be looking at temperatures that are around, 110, 120, 130. I know that Phantom Ranch regularly registers temperatures in the 3 digits. And I think last summer their high was 118 degrees or something like that. And there is no escaping from it. You have to be incredibly mindful of the fact that whatever you find on the rim is going to be radically different from the conditions that you're finding down below at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. And you have to be prepared to deal with both of those kind of extreme ends of the spectrum in terms of temperature and heat exposure. To put more context around that, an example from one of the several rim to rims that I've done, I've had times where I was in crampons and bundled up with a big down jacket up on the north rim. And then in the box, that flat section between Phantom Ranch and the bottom of the north rim, I was in a sports bra and I was watching my hydration and my electrolytes, and I was worried about overheating. So that is par for the course in the Grand Canyon. And you absolutely have to plan for that. There is no one perfect moment to hike the Grand Canyon because you're always going to deal with temperature extremes no matter what time of year. So how do you know if you're ready for that sort of thing? The most important thing that I would say is thinking about backpacking the Grand Canyon should induce a little bit of anxiety in you if you haven't done it before. If you look at it and you're like, oh, it's casual, whatever, it'll be fine, you're not ready. You need to have respect for the place. You need to acknowledge and to internalize that the extreme difference in conditions between the rim and between the bottom are different from pretty much anything that you're going to find on any backpacking trip, around the country. The Grand Canyon is very, very unique in the challenge of conditions that it poses to your average backpacker. So a little bit of anxiety and trepidation is good. If you don't have that, I would actually be worried. The other thing that you 100% need to be ready for this is excitement and big desire for just tremendous adventure and remoteness, right? If this sounds amazing and it sounds awesome and you have that, like, wow, I wish I could do that. You know what? Okay, let's talk about, how to make sure you're physically ready, but from a mindset perspective, that's A+. That's exactly what you want to be going for. The third thing that you need, so there's respect, there's excitement. And then the third thing that you need is fitness, because we've talked about it before. I'll say it again. It's not just the mileage, it is the steep descent and then the steep ascent on the way back out. And of course, the Grand Canyon is unique in that it has an elevation profile that is reverse from what we typically experience when we're hiking in the mountains, because in the Grand Canyon, you descend first, and then you have to come back up either the same way that you came in or on the other side. You can't stay at the bottom. That's not an option. So Grand Canyon hikers and rangers have the saying that says down is optional, up is mandatory. And, you have to understand that with every step that you're taking deeper into the canyon, you are committing yourself to a more and more difficult exit on the other end of your trip. So you have to be aware of that, and you have to bring the necessary fitness for your legs and your body to sustain the hike up, as well as that initial descent that can really trash your legs very, very badly, which then sets you up for failure for the rest of the trip. The final thing that I'll say is the rim to rim, in my opinion, or really any backpacking trip in the Grand Canyon, is not a trip to undertake if you don't have some backpacking experience already. Now, if you wanted to go and do a trip like this with a guide, I will qualify that statement. And I think there are situations where it's appropriate, in a guided scenario to have a first-time backpacker go into the Grand Canyon. But if you're doing this on your own and you're planning your independent, unguided rim to rim, you need to have backpacking experience, because you need to know what it feels like to carry the weight of the pack day after day after day after day. And you also, very importantly, need to be very familiar with your gear, with your sleep setup, with your stove, with your water system, with all of that, because the Grand Canyon is not a spot to experiment. Once you are down in the canyon, you have to come back up. And you don't want to be in a situation where, because you weren't adequately prepared, you end up having to call for rescue and put the rescue team at risk to get you out of a pickle that you didn't need to be in the first place. So essentially, the four things that I touched on: it's respect for the difficulty of it, it's excitement for the challenge, it is physical fitness, and it's backpacking experience. In my opinion, you need all four in order to be ready to tackle a rim-to-rim backpack on your own. Looking at this picture where you can pretty much see the entire rim-to-rim from the south rim here going out to the north, if you look at this and you're like, wow, this looks incredible, that is a pretty good indication that if you want to go and do it, I will share whatever I can to make sure you have the tactical and tangible tips and tricks to get you physically ready and gear ready. We're switching gear with that comment, and we're talking about training and physical preparation for a Grand Canyon rim-to-rim backpacking trip. Think back to the mileage and the vertical profile that I shared with you. You're looking at about 23 miles, and you're looking at about 11,000 feet of vertical change. In order to be ready for a hike of that distance and that steepness, there are a couple things that you want to keep in mind. So I already touched on the fact that the downhill is as hard, if not harder, than the uphill from a muscular perspective. So you have to be ready for that. From a mileage perspective, with 23 miles rim to rim, depending on how you break up the hike, if you do it in a single night or in 2 nights and 3 days, or potentially even in 3 nights and 4 days, you're probably looking at anywhere between 5 to 14 miles on a single day, followed by more hard, difficult, steep days. What that means is that in order to be safe, in order to enjoy yourself, and in order to come out on the other side of your rim-to-rim backpack looking excited and happy, like I think we are in this picture here, you want to prepare for endurance and cardio in such a way that you're ready for up to 10 hard miles a day. You want to do strength training that prepares you for carrying a 40-pound pack for those 10 miles each day. And you really, really, really want to be training for not just the uphill, but also the downhill. Now, those are the parameters and the kind of the goals that you're going to have to be able to accomplish and to be ready for in order to be successful in the Grand Canyon. And at the same time, I would highly advise that you build in a buffer. So what I mean by that is, when you're looking at cardio, okay, up to 10 miles of hard hiking each day, well, I can do that. 10 Grand Canyon miles are not the same as 10 miles, in Shenandoah or even Yosemite or wherever else. Like the Grand Canyon is very different because of those extreme conditions and because of the reverse elevation profile. So don't just manage to, I feel good about hiking 10 miles a day for 2 or 3 days in a row. No, manage to, a 30 to 50% buffer on top of that. Manage to, I feel good about, and I've trained for hiking 15 miles a day, and I know that I can do that. And I have that extra peace of mind knowing that I'm not just barely ready for the absolute minimum I'm going to need in the Grand Canyon, but I've exceeded that level. Same thing on the backpack. I put 40 pounds down here. I will say that depending on your experience level in backpacking and depending on the gear that you have, you may not need 40 pounds. As a matter of fact, when I'm in there for, a 2 or 3 day trip, I usually have somewhere between 25 and maybe 30 pounds if I carry the camera. But that requires a very careful selection of gear and requires experience of what you do and don't need. If you're relatively new to backpacking, 35 to 40 pounds is about realistic. So again, be ready for that. Don't just train with your pack here and there and once or twice, but make sure you get out there for an overnight ahead of time. Make sure that you know what it feels like to carry those 40 pounds up and down really steep stuff for multiple days in a row. For the hills, if you live anywhere close to the mountains, that's ideal. Go and find a trail that has about 3,000 or 4,000 feet in vertical change. If you can't find a trail that has that much in vertical change in a single go and do repeats on it, turn laps on it. If you don't live in the mountains, you're going to need to get on a stair stepper or work out in staircases and just find a way to mimic that vertical change. Because again, the biggest mistake that a lot of people make is that they say, okay, I'm training for the distance, I'm training for the uphill, I'm confident in my cardio, I feel good about this, but they neglect to take into account that you're starting out with a really steep downhill. And so you're trashing your legs on the first day. And if your legs aren't ready for that, and you then have another 2 or 3 days or 1 or 2 days to, get out and get up on the other side, you are going to be in for a very, very, very difficult time. So take the vertical change seriously and don't think so much about the uphill, think about the downhill. You absolutely need to make sure that you're not discomforted. Speaking of gear, I mentioned that, if my setup is typically somewhere around 25-ish pounds, more or less, for, 2-3 days in the canyon, that you might want to think about up to 40 pounds if you're newer to backpacking and you don't have ultralight gear. But as far as the overall gear list and kit goes that you need to be safe and successful on a Grand Canyon rim to rim backpack, it's relatively straightforward, actually. It's pretty standard for backpacking kit, but I'll run you through it here so you have the overview. You want a backpack that's somewhere around 50 liters, probably, a little bit bigger would be fine. A little bit smaller might be fine if you're used to packing very, very light. You need a sleeping bag. I typically recommend a sleeping bag that's rated to about 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, if you're hiking the Grand Canyon in the warmer months, you're not going to need a 20-degree bag, but remember what I said about the extreme temperature changes between the rims and the bottom. I have had times where I was sleeping without a sleeping bag down at the bottom of the Grand Canyon because it was too hot. And then when I got to the rim, overnight temperatures dropped to 28 degrees. So again, it is a very, very variable environment. And because of that, 20 degrees is typically what I like to carry. You should be able to get away with a 30-degree bag most of the times of the year as well, but 20 to be on the safe side. Sleeping pads, standard backpacking setup. A little pro tip, always, always, always have a foam pad, like a Z-Rest or something like that, because those are incredibly versatile. They can't puncture. You can do a lot of things with them. But if you're looking for optimal warmth and comfort, I actually pack 2 sleeping pads. I pack a foam pad, a Z-Rest, as well as a lightweight inflatable pad to pair that with. You need trekking poles. These are incredibly important for something like the Grand Canyon. And actually, generally, while backpacking, I would advise everybody to just use trekking poles as a standard anytime you're carrying a heavy pack. It makes a huge difference for your balance. It makes a huge difference for your joints and for your muscles. But particularly in the Grand Canyon, with that much vertical change, you want those trekking poles to help support your knees, because without trekking poles, you're just going to beat your body up a lot more than is necessary. And that's the last thing that you want to do on a big adventure like this. Water capacity, 3 liters is typically sufficient. We're going to talk about, seasons and everything in a second here, but 3 liters should be good. There's typically potable water sources along the trail. But again, when you're going on your own, if you're on an unguided trip, I would highly recommend having a way to treat water as well. So either iodine or a filter or a SteriPen in order to be able to take from the river or the creek if need be. You are probably going to want a tent. You can sleep out cowboy camp if the weather is nice. I do that a lot. That's a really easy way to save some weight, but most people like shelters. And then standard backpacking layers, going back once again to the extreme variability in conditions between the rim and the bottom of the Grand Canyon. You really do need all of those layers. Even in, May or June, the rims can still be very cold in the evenings and at night. So I personally will always have a lightweight down jacket. I will always have a Gore-Tex shell, and I will always have a mid layer for some added warmth, as well as lightweight long sleeve sun shirt that I can wear in hotter temperatures and lower down in the canyon. You want a headlamp, of course. And then again, if you're going on your own, you need to plan for all of your food, your cooking, and your meal setup. So, kitchenware, cookware, the stove, fuel, all of that. And then also very important, you do need your first aid setup and emergency communication. There's no cell coverage once you're below the rim, and I would highly, highly, highly recommend carrying a GPS messenger or Garmin InReach or something comparable if you are backpacking for multiple days in the Grand Canyon. There are things that happen, and there's accidents, there are extreme conditions, there's heat, there's cold, there is a sprained ankle, whatever it may be. There may be times that you need to get in touch with somebody on the outside. Having emergency communication on you rather than relying on, possible passersby who, or somebody at Phantom Ranch who may be able to call the rangers for you if an accident were to happen, is not a good strategy. So highly, highly, highly recommend that you come prepared with emergency communications as well. Now, if you have all the gear and you're thinking about how to put all of this in motion and actually start planning for your rim to rim through hike, what are you thinking about, or what should you be thinking about from my perspective in order to set yourself up for an awesome adventure that is successful and safe? The first thing that I would encourage you to think about is the seasons. From a timing perspective, when do you want to go and do this hike? You need to know a couple of things. First off, in the summer, and this is really June through September, the Grand Canyon in the inner canyon gets excruciatingly hot. As I said, Phantom Ranch registers temperatures in the 3 digits quite regularly, and I think the high last year was 118. There is very limited shade. You know, the sun is bouncing off the rocks and is just intensifying the temperatures through, you know, the radiation in there. So summer is not a good time to be in the Grand Canyon at all. It may be pleasant up on the rim, but it is a murderous hot hell down at the bottom, and people do die in there regularly from heat exhaustion. So that is not something to take lightly. So summer months aren't really great to do a rim to rim unless you are really, really heat acclimated and planning on mostly hiking in the night rather than during daytime. That is a way to, you know, go and mitigate some of those risks. But summer months generally not recommended for rim to rim. Winter months also a problem because the North Rim closes from the first snowfall, which is typically after October 15th, all the way to the 15th of May. So again, middle of October through middle of May, the North Rim is out, which means that even if you were to be able to hike from the South Rim all the way up to the North Kaibab Trailhead, you have no way of getting from that trailhead back down to the South Rim. You could make a rim to rim out of it and, you know, come back down the same way and hike back across to do a double crossing. But for a single rim to rim, you really can't do the winter months either because you have no way to complete the loop. That means that you're now looking at a pretty short window, late May, when the North Rim opens, to maybe early June. But again, June is already really hot. Even May can be really hot. And then October, you know, those are kind of the 2 prime seasons for rim to rims. One of the pro tips that I'll share here is that the North Rim of the Grand Canyon officially closes on the 15th of October, but the road typically doesn't close until the first major snowstorm. And in some years, that first major snowstorm doesn't happen until, you know, potentially late November, even early December. It's a risk, it's a gamble, but, you know, if you're willing to take that chance, planning for a rim to rim in late October or early November can actually be a fantastic time window as far as temperatures are concerned, as well as your likelihood of obtaining permits. Permits are the next big thing that you have to think about when you're planning a through hike here. In order to camp anywhere below the rim, you have to have a backcountry permit. And those permits, particularly for the rim to rim, are very competitive and they are not by any means guaranteed. So you need to go ahead and apply for those permits as early as possible when they become available. And I have actually included the schedule for you all here so you can get an idea. Permits are being allocated about 5 months ahead of time. So right now in late April, is when permit applications are accepted for September. So if you were thinking about a rim to rim this fall in October or November, for example, or September, you need to be applying either starting tomorrow or next month or the month thereafter. So that's something that's very important. There are a lot of people, you know, out of the select few that do venture below the rim in the Grand Canyon, a lot of those folks end up wanting to do a rim to rim or a rim to rim to rim. So these permits are some of the most competitive permits in the Grand Canyon. So the more flexibility that you have and the more patience you have and ability to try again and again, the better your odds are going to be of getting the itinerary that you would actually like to go and hike. Speaking of itineraries, there are 3 different campgrounds along this corridor that are overnight possibilities on your rim to rim. You have Cottonwood Campground on the north side, you have Bright Angel Campground and Phantom Ranch, which we talked about, and you have Havasupai Gardens halfway up the south rim. Now, it's possible to do the rim to rim, you know, in a single night. It's possible to do it in 2 nights. It's possible to do it in 3 nights. I mean, people do it even in a day. Sometimes that's a really hard hike, but it is possible. So you have a lot of different options and quite a lot of flexibility, but just know that in order to optimize your permit chances, what I would recommend is apply for the itinerary that sounds the best to you and then indicate to the rangers that you're willing to be flexible with your itinerary, so they may actually assign you different campgrounds. And generally speaking, if I had my pick and I could design a 2-night, 3-day itinerary in any way whatsoever without having to think about permit availability, I would start from the north side and I would do 1 night at Cottonwood Campground. That's about 7 miles down from the North Rim, and you've done that big descent at that point. I would spend a night there, and then I would hike all the way over to Havasupai Gardens. Actually, I wouldn't necessarily stay at Phantom Ranch, though it's beautiful if you've never been there, and if you have a chance to go and spend time there, that's fantastic. But for me personally, I really like Havasupai Gardens, and so I would hike all the way across to Havasupai Gardens, and then on the last day just hike out from Havasupai Gardens, maybe after catching sunrise at Plateau Point on the Tonto Plateau. That said, really any combination of these campgrounds is going to support you well for a rim to rim. Again, permits are really, really hard to get. So I would say the more flexible you can be, the easier it's going to be for you to actually obtain those permits. The other thing that you have to think about as you're setting up your rim to rim and your itinerary is that once you've crossed the canyon, you still need to figure out how to get back to where you started in order to close the loop. And in order to get from the North Rim to the South Rim, you have about 200 miles or 4 hours of driving to get all the way around, because of course there's no road that takes you straight across the canyon. You have to drive all the way around. That's something that you can either arrange with a Grand Canyon Hikers shuttle, or if you are traveling in a party with multiple vehicles, you can do that shuttle on your own. Just be mindful that you're going to have to, essentially do the shuttle on both ends of your trip, because you have to set up your car at the exit to start with, and then you have to go back to the start. And then once you've finished your hike, you have to take your trailhead exit vehicle and go back around to the beginning to go and pick up the other vehicle. So it's a lot of driving that's involved, but that is one of the things that you have to keep in mind when you're planning for a rim to rim through hike. You need to solve the shuttle situation. If you have an interest in hiking the rim to rim and this sounds really appealing to you, but you're not all that keen on dealing with all the permits, the shuttles, all of that, the food and whatnot, we do offer Grand Canyon rim to rim backpacking itineraries that are guided. We also offer a number of other itineraries. So the one thing that I'll say is, my heart is really attached to the rim to rim, to be honest, for a couple of different reasons. One, it eliminates the shuttle that I just talked about. Two, it also eliminates the whole seasonality constraint where you can't really do a rim to rim, during the winter because the North Rim isn't open. Guess what? You can do a rim to rim in the winter because you start from the south, you go to the north, and then you come back. And here's the other thing. The rim to rim is a bucket list. That's what a lot of people want to do. And that's a super cool hike. But if you think it's super cool, why not do it both directions? If you're training for the rim to rim in and of itself, doing the rim to rim, I think isn't that much harder, because you have more time, you have more flexibility. The terrain that you're covering it's the same. You're just doing it twice. I would say if you're interested in the rim to rim and hadn't yet thought about a rim to rim, I would encourage you all to think about if, maybe you make a slightly longer adventure out of it and remove a bunch of the constraints that you'd otherwise have at the rim to rim. We really care about being able to not just guide folks on the trail, but to also build community and really create a team experience. And that's why we ask everybody to show up on day one, and we'll do a welcome dinner. We'll do gear check. We'll go over all the things that are important before we hit the trail. Then there's a night lodging in town that is included. And then the next day we do the trailhead transfer. We start on the trail, we'd go and we do our hike. And once the hike is done, same thing again, we transfer back to town, we have a final dinner, and you have another night of lodging included in the price.